A little over a year ago, Can You Hear Me was created with the guiding principle of sharing communications best practices, especially those relevant for CEOs and others in leadership positions. A year later, this program has evolved as a template for companies and their leaders when it comes to the nuances of some of the most delicate communication issues of our day. Join co-hosts Rob Johnson and Eileen Rochford as they review some of their favorite topics and look ahead to year two and what they have in store. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Can You Hear Me? I'm Rob Johnson, president of Rob Johnson Communications.
And I'm Eileen Rochford, CEO of the marketing and strategy firm, the Harbinger Group. This is indeed a very special edition of our podcast because, drumroll please, it has been 1 year since we launched our show. So today we're going to look back on what the world looked like when we launched, the various topics we've covered throughout our first year, and all kinds of things we learned and observed during the inaugural year of hosting Can You Hear Me? So first, to set the stage, let's look back on what was happening when we set out on this journey. In a lot of ways, the spring of 2021 was another, honestly, very dark and challenging time.
Yeah, that's true, Eileen. And even though the vaccines were coming online and people were getting them and people were looking forward to the summer, it was nationally a very uncertain time. As you mentioned, the trial of former officer Derek Chauvin was taking place in Minneapolis, and the whole city, state, and much of our nation was reliving the horror and pain of George Floyd's vicious murder once more. Then when you had another Black man, Daunte Wright, was murdered by a police officer and his death was declared unlawful, another wave of protests erupted in Minneapolis. And then the congressional investigation into the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack by insurrectionists was underway. And the nation had to relive that traumatic day as well and grapple with the political infighting that ensued.
In addition, Rob, there were more than 10 mass shootings making headlines in states across the entire country last spring in a 6-week period. And coronavirus continued to rage, postponing return to work plans for companies nationwide. Much of that didn't even happen until this year. Yet, even a year ago, we were talking about it as if it was imminent. And unemployment, while it had continued to drop since its spike of record proportions the year prior in April of 2020, the numbers were still double pre-pandemic rates. So things were really tough for many, many businesses and many, many, many people. In short, the emotional and psychological struggles continued mounting, and businesses were increasingly called upon to support employees and customers in new and complex ways. So Rob and I got together and we decided we wanted to start this show to talk about how to navigate these truly tumultuous times. Probably, I'm 50 and I had never seen anything like it in my lifetime.
Yeah, I got to tell you, it was, and I'm glad when we first came up with the idea for the first topic for our first podcast, which was called Trust in the Age of the Pandemic, how 2020 changed communications forever. I think, when we were sitting here thinking about what can we start talking about, what ideas can we kick around, I think that was so important because so much had changed. And the pandemic really changed the way the people that were trusted. For instance, we talked about the Edelman Trust Barometer and how for years, your employer was sort of seen as, oh gosh, they're going to spin this or spin that, and they're not so reliable. And then once everybody's working from home, they were saying, I trust my employer to give me the most meaningful information out there. I thought that was really interesting. And I just think from that trust factor and the fact that we were right in the midst of this pandemic, I know a year later, we're hopeful that we're not, but thinking back to that time, it was very much a time of uncertainty.
Definitely. Absolutely. What's interesting is not long ago, you and I completed this year's, the show about this year's report, or 2021's really report on trust. And a lot of things remained the same from what we discussed in our first episode, a year later from that research, a lot of things remain the same. A lot of things continue to spike in places where I personally thought, are you kidding? This trust in employers is not going to continue.
Right. It was a little surprising. I agree, because you thought, well, is this a blip on the radar because of the pandemic?
Yeah.
And now, and not that 2 years is going to, set the tone forever, but now you got 2 years of this information and it's basically the same.
Yeah. And if I had to make a prediction, I would say that that's going to ebb and flow, or that's going to spike and drop the issue rather of,
I think you're right,
trusting employers. And that's going to be driven by a whole host of conditions and things that evolve and change. So I don't think that's going to remain the same. I'm just making a prediction right now. I'm not saying it's going to change in a year, but I don't know how long that's going to stick around. So
we'll play this back in a year from now. Was Eileen right or wrong?
Go ahead, do it. But there are many ways that the pandemic did change communications forever. And, you and I are recording this right now on Zoom, and that's probably the number one way. Virtual communications, being able to work and complete successfully, working together as teams on different continents even, it was proven to be absolutely possible and almost necessary. So I'm really happy, and I'm going to make that prediction too. There's no going back on that one, baby. We're here.
You know what?
Yeah.
And we're taking a little bit of an aside here, because that wasn't part of our first episode, but we were talking about, outlets like this, Zoom and what it's meant. And I remember when I started doing virtual presentation training for clients, and they're like, wow, this isn't going to last.
Right.
Well, once I get back in the boardroom, I'm not going to have to remember any of this stuff you're telling me. And then I was like, you know what? Why don't you hold that thought for a little bit? And here we are, a year and a half, 2 years later, and bosses have figured out that this really works. It may not work for every meeting, but it works for a lot of them. And there's a lot of cost savings, and there's a lot of efficiency, and there's a lot of reasons to keep doing it. So guess what? If you haven't mastered virtual presentation training, I know somebody you can talk to.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. That was super subtle, Rob. So kudos. Yep. For that.
What?
Yeah.
I have no idea what he's talking about.
Rewind the tape, please. Anyways.
I think for me, one of the greatest joys in creating Can You Hear Me has been watching it grow and evolve. We created this as sort of a best practices when it came to communication strategy for a number of subjects. And while I know we've stayed true to that mission, I've also been proud of the fact that this evolved into best practices for company leaders and C-suite level executives on so many different subjects. And when we talked about CEO brands and the challenges that CEOs face, there's so many episodes that we did focused on the C-suite and focusing on the leadership and trying to give best ideas that we had to help them along, because the role of the CEO has changed dramatically in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Particularly the last two, no doubt about it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny when you look at, not that anybody cares other than you and me, the actual download numbers of our top episodes. Yeah. So many of them had really practical advice for, business leaders and C-suite level executives, things that they can do specifically. And we're going to run through a few of those in our little walk down memory lane over the past year.
But I thought it was really, for me, that part was exciting because it really has evolved and it really has become that. I feel like we can talk about a litany of subjects related to communication, and we do on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. But I feel like some of those episodes were, I think, very handy for people who are in positions of authority who probably don't have time to sit around listening to podcast after podcast. But for those that actually listen to ours, and there is some evidence that, a few people were listening, more than a few people were listening. Mm-hmm. I hope it was helpful to them, because I just, like I said, the role changed so much, and what was expected of CEOs 3 to 5 years ago is far different than what's expected now.
Mm-hmm. And some of the feedback that I frequently hear from different people, but there's a common theme, is how the show has evolved into like a connection between current events, current issues, and best practices for communications. It's kind of like the melding of the two. Like, mm-hmm. All right, so here's what we're experiencing. here's what, that may mean. Let's dig into the topic a little bit, but then let's go at it from the angle of, so, okay, now that we know the problem, we talked about the problem. Now, how do we address it strictly from being a great communicator, to help yourself and your company get through the situation?
Yeah. What are the solutions to that problem? I think that's what we try to be mindful of as well. We can point out what the issue is. We can discuss it chapter and verse, but at the end of the episode, I hope that you say, well, I also got some pretty actionable, good advice that may be helpful.
Totally. And this is the part where I'm going to say, hey, our number one listener who's out there somewhere, if you have a show idea or if you have a specific thing that you want us to address when we post this episode and up on LinkedIn, respond to either one of us and let us know, because we're dying to hear your ideas. We always are.
We always are. And I've gotten a multitude of ideas, as have you, Eileen, and we haven't incorporated every single one of them, but I think we've probably discussed every single one of them. And some of them have actually become show ideas.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So we are thoughtful about it, even if we haven't acted on every single one of them. We've certainly discussed every single idea that's come our way.
Yes, that was the disclaimer, subtly delivered from Rob. Well done. So, okay, out of our 22 episodes, is that right? From our first year?
Yes.
Holy cow. I know we have more in the can, but still, it's fun to say. So 22 episodes that we launched in our first year. Today, we've chosen just a few favorites to highlight, and we're going to look at them through the lens of time having passed, which is really fun, right? Okay, what's changed? And were we super off on that? But I'll go first, and I'll bring up our second episode. It was titled "When Facts Are Optional, Trust Takes a Nosedive." And that was with our very first guest, the crisis communications veteran and dear friend of mine, a person I totally adore, Harlan Loeb. And it was a great show. It was so fun for you and I to kind of delve into, we get to interview someone and hear all the things that they think about this issue, which I really enjoyed. And we realized having guests is going to be one of, at least for me, one of my favorite part of doing this show.
Oh yeah, I agree. And certainly for somebody that interviewed people for years and years in my other life and television, I always love exploring things with people and interviewing them and having a good discussion. And so being able to do that with some of our guests, and Harlan being the first one, and then having somebody like that, that's such a wealth of knowledge that has been front and center for so many crisis issues, corporate crisis issues in the last 20, 25 years. For me, it was fascinating to talk to somebody like that, who really is a smart person and who really had some great ideas about this whole idea that, the world we live in, facts are optional. So it's like, I disagree with your facts, so I'm going to make up my own. And I think you and I look at that as a really problematic issue that has really caught on in this world. And I think we're trying to hold some of these people that are in positions of authority, whether it be corporate politics or whatever the case, to some level of accountability.
Yep. And the phrase that I loved that Harlan used, that I'll admit I've used it a couple of times, given totally full credit where it's due. But the phrase he said in the show was erosion of the sanctity of facts. And that's really what happened, right?
Brilliant.
It's not that they're optional, but that the sanctity has now just almost disappeared because people are choosing to view them as optional, right? So I encourage everybody to check out that episode. I'm going to put links to all the faves we list today in our show notes, so you remember. But treasure trove of great information and advice, guidance shared by Harlan from episode 2.
Yeah, that was a really fun one. And then the one I want to point out next is episode 4, one of our more popular ones of the year. This generated a lot of discussion and downloads. And I remember when we first were talking about it, and you had this idea of having some of your interns come on and talk about the new female workforce. I was like, well, they haven't really joined the workforce yet. What are they going to have to say about it? So episode 4, the new female workforce, what do they want? And we had 3 of your Harbinger Group interns talking about entering the workforce, their hopes and their requirements of that first job. And I have to say, I was just blown away at how thoughtful and how poised and how smart and how dynamic they all were. And for me, going into it like, yeah, I'll give it a whirl. Like, we're creating this out of nothing. So it's not like we have one way to do things. Yeah, I'll try it out. Let's give it a whirl. It absolutely exceeded my expectations, and the popularity of that particular episode just really, I was like, you know what? We can talk about anything. If we have good guests and we have a good topic, people are going to listen to this. And they did for that one and many others as well, but that one in particular.
And I think it was because, so many leaders are older, right? Let's say for the most part, they're in their mid 30s on up. And they really kind of have lost touch with people who are 21, 22. And because that's a lot of time span in between, and the life stages are vastly different, right? So the opportunity to hear from those people directly, to have them state the things that they're going to look for and evaluate in potential employers once they get out with their degree and all their many credentials, including a great internship, that it's important, to hear that and know that as someone or a business leader who has to lead people, more and more younger people. Got a lot of turnover in the workforce right now. So people are really having to onboard successfully, and understanding the mindset of these folks is obviously essential, critical. So that's why I think the show is so popular. It was the opportunity to just listen, and further having three women in particular, and from diverse, varying backgrounds, who really could speak to a range of things that were important to them. It was a great show. So if you're a listener wanting to get in touch with younger folks who are coming and understand their mindset, check that one out. So again, we'll drop that into the show notes touch on. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no. And one final note on that too. It's interesting because it really spoke to what the younger generations, what millennials and Gen Ys are looking for in terms of leadership. And they're looking for work-life balance. They want authenticity. And those are hallmarks for what they're looking for in bosses, because as you mentioned, onboarding and recruiting talent is one thing, retaining them is another thing, but both of those things take a lot of time, effort, money, everything. And if you hire them, you want to keep them. And so there was a feeling from them that everything trickles down. So your team can only be as great as the person for whom it's trickling down from. So in this case, it would be Eileen Rochford, the CEO of the Harbinger Group. I heard she's excellent. But I mean, but this wasn't like a pat on the back kind of moment at all. It was just them being honest, but in the way that you're authentically interacting with your employees and what you're offering them just shows that you get it. So there's a shameless plug for you.
Aren't you sweet? Thank you. That's why we keep you around.
Right.
Yeah, that was a great show. I could talk about that one all day, but we're going to move on to our next fave. So in episode 6, we focused a little more intently on kind of the issues that face the C-suite. And that was the episode that we called Building and Protecting the CEO Reputation. Is it a me brand or a we brand? And all credit for that awesome title goes to you, Rob. And people love that show.
It's so funny because that is one that gets recited back to me more than any. And it's always so great to have people say, hey, I listened to your podcast. So all those years I was on TV and somebody'd say, hey, I watched your newscast. You're like, oh, okay. I mean, but this is heart and soul stuff here. This is, I mean, we're pouring our expertise, our creativity, everything into this. So when somebody says, hey, I really like what you said about the we brand and the me brand, and I get it, I really did appreciate that. And that's something that gets recited back to me time and time again, because it really resonated with the listeners.
Yeah. And it was just a great reminder to so many. And if it wasn't a reminder, it was a lightning bolt kind of moment for them to realize, I haven't been thoughtful about the kind of leader brand I want and I need to be. And I got to think that through. And identify, am I me or we? And depending on which one I, am authentically, well, I need to be consistent in my behaviors, my choices, my words. So it was a really good show. Another one that we definitely encourage you to check out if you didn't hear it the first go round.
And for people that are like so the we brand is a CEO that would go on LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever their favorite social network is, and is saying, hey, look at my workers in this office or this store here and there. They're doing a great job. So the we brand CEO is the one is deflecting a lot of the attention and praise and everything else and saying, hey, look at what a great team I have. The me brand is, hey, look at me. I'm the CEO and aren't I great? And so for those people that are like, that think they kind of know what we were talking about, that's kind of a little bit more color around that.
Yeah. So think, Elon Musk for me brand, for example.
Yes. That's a perfect example.
Right now. Right. He is all over that Twitter. Oh yeah.
Right. And everybody's like, hey, I wonder if Elon Musk will allow so-and-so back on or do this or that. It's like, well, the me brand guy is going to figure out something to draw attention to himself. That's for sure. So episode 8, we were kind of taking this concept of the we brand and the me brand. And then we were very lucky to have Ulta Beauty CEO, Dave Kimball, who's just absolutely, I mean, if you're looking for a CEO that's doing it the right way in terms of his social media presence and just being out there and talking about his company and talking about the people that make it special, I mean, it's really refreshing to see it. And I think what was interesting about Dave, who is an old friend of mine from my college days, my fraternity days, is that we were like, Dave, way to go with the we brand thing. And he's like, I'm just being who I'm being. like we were, and we weren't being cynical. We were just kind of giving him kudos for being that good at it. And he's like, I'm just out there. I'm at, store 1272 in somewhere, Ohio. And I'm talking about the great work these folks are doing and whatever. And I post it and it's just what I do. So it wasn't like he had come up with this great grand plan and he had strategized over it. He was just like, this is what I do. And that's that's one of the reasons it was so refreshing. And I think it's another reason why it had so many downloads.
Yeah. The number one downloaded show of all time for us. And I think the title really summed it up: elevating others and leading with heart. That's really that's who he is, what he represents, how he conducts himself, and getting a peek and hearing from his own words, why that's his approach, why that's authentic to him, how he does it, was such a joy. And I remain a massive fangirl of his and totally loved that we were able to have him on. It was quite an honor. So there's so much to learn from that episode though. So again, I'll drop it in the show notes. Really would love anyone who hasn't heard it to check it out, because there's nothing that Dave said that doesn't hold true today, which is always true of the most authentic leaders. Their leadership style, could have been 100, 200 years ago. But if they're doing it right and doing it well, it will stand the test of time. And that show certainly has.
And I think episodes 6 and 8, the we brand and me brand episode, and then the Dave Kimball episode, they really kind of go hand in hand. Like you listen to one and it kind of leads into the other thing. I think it kind of helps it come full circle, that whole idea of that, and the weird thing is though, if, Dave was a leader 200 years ago, it would be weird to see him so much on LinkedIn,
it would be so weird. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
But it was, it was most downloaded. That's not why I liked it. I liked it because it was my old friend who was gracious with his time and who had such great down to earth, practical advice. It was it made so much sense.
Yeah. He is a CEO to respect. There's no question about it. So, and I'm always looking for people like that to follow. So if any of our listeners are like me in that respect, definitely check out Dave Kimball from Ulta Beauty. So then by episode 10, this is October of 2021, early October, we were thinking about the toll, the pandemic, the cumulative time that had passed, like what the toll that had taken on all of us, and the concerns that I have as the CEO for my employees, particularly at that time. It was really starting to, boil over. And we called that show The Overwhelm Hangover. Interestingly, this was our top 3 show of all time for downloads. So again, that makes me feel really good, because that was a time where we shared a lot about personal experience. And I think when we're honest on this show and are willing, to kind of bear it all to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Our listeners appreciate that. So one of the things that we covered in that show, and here's why I'm going to share it. It's interesting to me now. It's May. And I'm already realizing that what we talked about back then is now even worse for me. So
Really?
I'll just recap. Yeah. So at the time, we were beginning to really kind of amp up significantly more in-person meetings, right?
Right.
And all of that involves so much. You have to think about what you're going to wear. You have to go to the effort of, for me, and most people, doing your hair to various degrees. That's just sometimes you have to, for some women,
because you hadn't had to do it for so long.
Exactly. Choosing to put on makeup. What shoes am I going to wear? It's all such a big pain. Some love it. I personally was thrilled at being able to kind of leave that, drain of time behind for so long. So there's that, right? There's just like the mental little micro, tasks that are taking a toll. You got to think about all those things now, increasingly. And at that time, we talked about how our days were getting longer because now networking events had been added, and that means, gosh, you might be leaving your house pretty early in the morning to get to an early morning face-to-face meeting, followed by maybe a networking lunch, and then all the other things. And you got to still stay in circulation out there, socializing through the evening, and come home. And having not had to do that for so long, like rebuilding up those muscles, not just the small talk, but it's almost like the tenacity. You had to find it again for how can I get through a day this long, and you know what I'm saying. So all that stuff, that's what we talked about on that show, and we were really honest about how we needed, as business leaders, and myself included, to recognize that means that people are more emotionally exhausted, right? And that's going to be the case while we're all kind of remembering, relearning how to act that way when we didn't have to for so long. Maybe the only two people we encountered in a day were our mail delivery person and maybe a spouse or a roommate, right? And all of a sudden you're having to smile all the time at everyone who passes you on the street. If you're that kind of person, say hi, make the small talk like I talked about. It's just, it takes a toll, right? It's funny. I was thinking about my calendar, and I know, Rob, you're experiencing this too. We both are having these insane months of interacting with people, way more real meetings.
Yep.
Way more, you're emceeing events all over the place and hosting live things. So it's not being done, via Zoom anymore as much.
No, it's back in person.
Yeah.
And again, you're used to not going to the office as much, and a lot of people are on hybrid schedules now. And I would say last week and this week, having to get in a suit and be downtown 4 days in a week. That's, that used to be the norm. And now I'm like, whoa, 2 of those back-to-back weeks, this is insane. And so it has a different definition. But I will say this about episode 10 that I really loved, and you talked about it. It was so authentic. It is something that you'd given great thought to. It was something that was weighing on you. And not only was it weighing on you, you knew it was weighing on your employees, and you had enough self-awareness and care and empathy for them that you're like, I'm really worried about them. And so it really came from a personal place, the overwhelm hangover. And that's one of the things I loved most about that episode. It was so personal, and you were able to share it, and you were willing to share these challenges that you were facing and your employees were facing. And because it was so authentic, I think it's what made it so powerful. So I just, that was my favorite part about that episode.
Thank you. And I'm glad people really it resonated. That's clear. And that's great. Right now, I think it's crazy how it seems like, oh my gosh, everything we talked about then, it's like that times 10. So it's another little moment in time when we can say to everybody, hey, give yourself some grace. It's okay. You're not going to be at your best every second of these now, 10-hour days, and sometimes in a string of them or more. So it's
nobody
okay.
has all the answers. It's okay not to have the answer. It's okay to say, how are you? How are you doing? It's okay to show weakness. I think that was
Yeah.
one of the big takeaways. People are like, stiff upper lip and everything's fine and this and that. We're gutting through it and whatever. And it's like, it's okay to say, I've had some moments of weakness, because we all have. And if you say you haven't, then you're not telling the truth.
No doubt.
So episode 12 was really a little counter programming, in my opinion, but I loved it because we've been in the space so much about what's going on with workers, what's going on with, the C-suite leaders and that sort of thing, and how is the pandemic sometimes shaping them. And on episode 12, we talked about the realities of cybersecurity with our guest, Rina Bajawala from Ice Miller. She's an attorney and cybersecurity expert. And this was especially important at the time, and I think really all the times right now, because cyber threats to companies are real and they're ever increasing. And when this happens to a company, what do you do? How do you react? What's the right way and the wrong way to do it? And so for me, it was a little bit different than some of the things we'd been talking about, but because it was different, but it's still related to communicating a message about preparing for something like a cyber threat, which they're real. And when they hit you as a company, they are devastating. And so I'm glad that we were able to have Rina on to talk about it. She was terrific.
She was so authoritative, and her knowledge was clear and evident. She shared some very specific best practices, and you'll laugh, but I think I may have even said on the show, as Eileen writes down, call company's insurance agents. And I did the next day, and gave full credit to those she will get no commission, Rina, for the increase in our coverage for potential threats of that nature to a business of our type. So yeah, lots of important information in there too. That was a great show.
No doubt.
So then we kind of spun off into the episodes 13 to 15, I believe. They were all related, and they dealt heavily with CEO concerns for 2022, COVID related and otherwise, if I recall. Am I right? I think so.
Yeah. And I think these were interesting because they were all loosely related, but it was all CEO concerns. What's keeping CEOs awake at night? And a lot of them had to do directly with COVID and then indirectly with COVID. So things like supply chain and talent retention and things of that nature that were unique to the times that we live in. And they were additional. So aside from your revenue better be up, you better be providing shareholder value, all the things that you've always had to do as a CEO. And now you have a whole list of new things that you're responsible for, that people, if they're not dealt with correctly, are going to be looking at you like, what's your problem, Mr. and Mrs. CEO?
Oh, gosh, you have me thinking about how a couple of times in different shows we touched on the CEO data about how often they've thought of either quitting their job or they're planning to leave in the next year. Because gosh, has that job gotten really hard?
Yeah. I've worked my whole career to get here, and now that I'm here,
it's kind of like becoming president. Like you get there, and then 4 years later, the before and after photos.
Right.
They look
here's before. Wait, that guy didn't have, or that person didn't have gray hair, and then all of a sudden, all they have is gray hair, and you're like, yeah, that's the job.
Yeah,
that's the job.
Seriously.
Well, episode 17, and we referenced it earlier when we initially did the 2020 one Edelman Trust Barometer when we first started the show, and then we did 2022s, and we had some terrific guests on for episode 17. It was Lissa Druss, the CEO and founder of Strategia, and Anne-Marie Mitchell, a former agency colleague of yours and now a college professor. Two dynamic women that know their stuff. And it was fun to talk about the trust barometer in the prism of, where they saw some of these numbers falling in their own, respective worlds. So for Lissa, it's marketing and strategy, similar to what you do. And Anne-Marie is somebody that grew up in the agency world and now is a college professor. And
she keeps, kind of occasional toe in doing consulting with some really big name clients too. So I thought Anne-Marie's kind of bridging of the issues that are faced by brands from the trust perspective with the issues or the perspectives of the students whom she interacts with on a daily basis and what they say and do, and how it's so clear that their trust in brands, their trust in the social construct really has eroded to a just a even more concerning degree than what the research showed. So her examples from the classroom and her students were really eye-opening for me, and I'm sure for you too, Rob.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And just having their insight on all of that was just really fascinating. And I enjoyed every second of our time with them. And one of the other ones I was thinking about, one of our most recent episodes, which was The Future of Journalism with Benny Enos, who I know
Yes.
you've worked with. I
Yes.
worked with her in television. She's now, she had been a college professor in Northern Illinois and at Columbia College, and now is a instructor at Geneva High School, teaching the minds of tomorrow about
Yeah.
journalism. And so for me, it was good because, that's my former world. And obviously I have a great interest in what's going on. And I really appreciated her passion and her optimism about the fact that, yes, the business is changing, but here are ways that young people are going to be relevant in this business moving forward, because some people say, journalism's dead, or it's dying a slow death, or blah, blah, blah. And Benny took the absolute opposite approach on that.
I know, that was really reassuring, wasn't it? And I love that we were able to, through our guests, bring so Benny at the high school level and college, but currently high school, and very real in the programming and even the topics of the daily show that they produce, at Geneva High School.
Yeah.
And then also at the college level from Anne Marie. If you kind of listen to those shows together back to back, that's a pretty interesting way to digest that information and get some real insight into the younger minds of future communicators, don't you think?
Because, in the history of the world, kids these days, they said it about us, and now we're saying it. And so it's interesting to have people that are connected in that way, whether it be college or high school, the people that are going to be entering the workforce, that are going to be pursuing various careers, and to get their insights, and to understand that, say for journalism, because, we were just talking about it. It's going to be far different than when somebody like me entered, 120 years ago or whatever it was. Maybe 108 years ago. I can't remember. It was a long time.
That was so long ago. Oh my God. We're still using pens and paper.
I know. What? Yes. Typewriters? What?
Oh God. I don't think I ever used a typewriter. Wow. Okay. So there we have it. And now the question is, where do we go from here?
Yeah. So you asked the question, but I'm going to ask you. So where do we go from here, Eileen?
You're going to ask me that question? That's so unfair.
I think we're going to ask each other this question.
Yeah.
I think what I would like to see is I would like to see us further hone our discussion points about what we talk about, to continue making it relevant, but also taking it to another level when it comes to, I think, the guests that we talk to, and the discovery that we have with those guests. And probably, a year under our belt, it's time to start thinking about how do we promote this a little bit more intently and kind of go to the next level, because I think the first year we've been very encouraged by what we've seen. And it's like, all right, that's a good first year, but what are you going to do for the second year?
It's funny. It's kind of like when we all tell our clients, like, you're not going to live off of referrals and word of mouth forever. Right. We know that. We know, but it's been a lot of fun, and let's just call it a soft launch, if you will. We've had a great time, and I think that we've decided we're going to keep doing this, and I hope our listeners will stay with us and help us to promote the show to other people they think would really like to listen to it. And honestly, I would love to hear more from our listeners about the topics that, you all want to hear us go after, and even guests. So there's the invitation yet again to please tell us what you think. And we'll definitely put it into the show plan and the editorial calendar to pursue. So let us hear from you.
No, it's great. The feedback that we get, and the fact that people are like, hey, we're listening. And whether it's, I really like what you said about this, or have you thought about that? Or what about this guest, which are some of the inquiries that we get. I'm just glad that we have that feedback, and that we have that dialogue with our listeners.
Totally. So we're grateful for everybody out there who spends a little time with us every few weeks when we put up a new show.
Indeed, we are. And this is so much fun to kind of go back and look at, where we came from a year ago and to kind of go over some of these episodes that really had meaning for us. So this was a lot of fun. And I hope that people that are listening, I hope that had value for you all. And with that, I will say thank you for listening to our 1-year anniversary special of Can You Hear Me? I'm Rob Johnson.
And I'm Eileen Rochford. Remember, you can listen to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts: Apple, Google, Spotify, and more. We'll see you next time, everybody. Thanks.